Everyone, this is part 2 of 4.10 Economic Growth and Development Strategies. Next we'll look at market-based policies. These were strongly advocated for by the World Bank, the IMF and US Congress, and that was sort of the approach that was called the Washington Consensus, because these three bodies are located in Washington, and that, I guess, an ideology on free market capitalism was the way to bring countries into growth and development. One aspect of that, I guess, is trade liberalization. Now, there wasn't much evidence to support the success of this, partly because of some factors. So tariff escalation. So developed countries often had higher tariffs on processed products versus raw products. Now, this really severely limited the ability for developing countries to diversify. We talked earlier about how they should want to diversify into more processed and manufactured goods, but with that trade protection, it makes it very hard. There was also a lack of interventionist support, I guess, with the thought that the trade liberalization would do the work for them, but the success of the Asian tigers showed that strong interventionist support in those specific industries could be quite useful. And also, developed countries tend to have strong protection on their own agriculture. And agriculture is one area where developing countries really should have a bit of an advantage, but that's cancelled out by the tariffs and the subsidies. Okay, a couple of other market-based policies: privatization, deregulation. Now, we should be able to draw these on a diagram, so maybe have a go, and I'll put mine up in a few seconds, so take a pause, I guess. Here's what we should be drawing. We've got LRS and SRS shifting over. We know the reasons why. If you don't, bit of revision you need. There's little evidence to support the success of these policies either. So what they found is proper regulation must be maintained to prevent the privatization turning into strong private monopolies. Successful privatization often involves still strong regulation of those industries so that they don't exploit the customers and have too much market power. And deregulation, especially in labor markets, can actually worsen inequality. So think of things like stripping away employment protections, having lower minimum wage, for example, that less job security, that can worsen the inequality, which obviously not good. Now, this is a quote from a former chief economist of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz. It says countries followed the neoliberal model, but they weren't especially strong, while other countries who ignored it, they experienced a high rate of sustained growth. So these policies, they weren't particularly effective. So interventionist policies. We'll start with redistribution. So this is one of our sustainable development goals: reduce inequality within and among countries. So this is more focusing on within. Tax is a way of doing this. So these countries could increase the progressivity of their income tax. So as income increases, the tax paid increases. They could put greater indirect taxes on luxury goods. So again, a way of taxing the higher income earners, the ones with higher wealth, and also those which create the negative externalities to remove those problems. Increase corporate taxes. They could tax land. Again, land is more likely to be owned by the wealthy. And they could also introduce measures to reduce tax evasion. Another way, transfer payments. So this is linked to tax, obviously. The more tax you collect, the more you can redistribute income with transfer payments. So benefits in kind, like could be, vouchers, I guess. So increases incomes for the lower end, which will increase consumption and greater access to health and education. So they've actually got the income to spend on those. Very important. Minimum wage is another way, I guess, of redistributing. I was going to get you to draw that, but I've already chucked it up there. We're very comfortable with the minimum wage diagram, I would have thought. Now, one argument against minimum wages is the idea that they can create unemployment. So we can see that here. If this is higher, the difference between the demand and supply of labour is greater, more unemployment. But there are a lot of studies that suggest that job losses only occur if the minimum wage is set at an unreasonably high level. And what is also necessary to get this to work is compliance measures to make sure that they aren't avoiding the minimum wage, paying cash under the table, that sort of thing. But obviously the lower income earners having a higher income can greatly help in growth and development, more consumption, and also higher standard of living. This is still interventionist, really, provision of merit goods. So these are two other sustainable development goals, healthy lives and education. So we'll look at education first. Now, education has some positive externalities. So I think it would be a good idea to do a quick little revision on that, draw that diagram. I've left part of it there. I don't think that'll be much of a clue, but pause and I'll show it in a second. Okay, there it is. Positive consumption externalities, so two demand curves. We should know how the rest of it works. If you don't, you know what you need to be doing. So the benefits of education, increased growth. We can get more skilled people who can help the country become more competitive internationally. Tends to provide for political stability, a more educated population, greater health outcomes. People actually understand what they're doing and how to help themselves. It increases the development of technology that we can see, and studies all over have shown usually a far lower crime rate the more educated a population is. Some problems with it, we get what's called a brain drain. So people get educated and realize that they can make much higher incomes overseas. So that's an international brain drain. And we can also get an internal brain drain where people have really high incomes, really high education, but there's actually not much work in that field because it's a poor country. So they end up working, they're underemployed, as taxi drivers or whatever, when they could be really successful engineers. And we also get a lot of people working for private interest. So working just to have a high income for themselves. So there might be a doctor charging really high fees to the wealthy, and that's not really helping the development of the country that much. So it's a bit of a downside to it. Okay, next, health. A lot of benefits from this. Productivity. People are going to be working a lot better. Growth again. Health outcomes, obviously. People are going to stay healthier. It reduces inequality and should lead to a lot less absolute poverty because people can actually afford to get healthcare because it's provided. So especially if it's free at the point of delivery, that's really powerful in reducing poverty. But despite this, there are often powerful political interests opposed. So we see this in the US, even a highly developed country, supposedly. They are hugely against providing free healthcare to people. So you can imagine what can happen in less educated populations in these poorer countries. It can be a bit of a struggle. Okay, infrastructure. We know how infrastructure works to help out. I've stuffed up the diagram a little bit there, but let's say we're in this position. How does providing infrastructure help? Well, we get the AD boost, of course, from building it, the government spending, and then we get the increased productivity and lower cost of production, shifting the LRS and SRS curves. So the really useful infrastructure for developing countries, energy. We need to to be able to power our industries. Transport, that really helps lower costs of production and also get our exports out to the rest of the world. Telecommunications, I think that's going to be very useful. Clean water and sanitation for health as well, very useful. The infrastructure. So we can see how this provides both growth but also health outcomes for the country. And the last thing we'll look at in this video is foreign direct investment. So this is long-term investment by a multinational corporation in another country. So why do they do it? Why do they want to invest in developing countries? So there's a few reasons. They've got lots of resources. If they set up an operation there, they can extract those resources and use them for themselves. They love that. Low-cost labor. Labor costs much lower in developing countries than developed countries. Low-cost regulation. They don't usually have as much regulation in there. Think of things like environmental regulations. There's less work to do to meet the regulation, so it lowers their cost of production if they produce in these countries. And they can also have access to emerging markets. So if we looked at those regional free trade agreements before in the last video, if a multinational sets up there, they can export to those other countries without the tariffs, which they wouldn't be able to do from their home country. So that's why they would be interested. What makes a country an attractive target for FDI? There's lots of things. The low cost we've spoken about. Low tax is another version of low cost. If you've got low corporate taxes, that increases the amount of profit that they're able to make, right? If they've got useful infrastructure involved, especially if it's export oriented, or we want reliable sources of energy and water. They're very useful for production, but also access to ports and getting the exports out of the country. That can be very useful. Education, we want a skilled workforce. So we want them to be cheap, but we want them to be skilled as well. So that will help. Regulation in favor of multinationals is really useful. Some countries have rules about foreign ownership and the amount of foreign exchange that can move around. So they want them to be in their favor. And they also like stable economic and political environments. So they want to know that the country is less likely to have huge spikes in inflation or a new government that comes in and completely changes everything. So the more stable the environment, the more attractive it is for their investment. What do the poorer countries get out of this? What do the developing countries get? How does it aid growth and development? A few ways. It's investment. So we can see how that's growth straight away, aggregate demand. It's investment firstly, and then the export revenue will come in. There's foreign direct investment goes into the financial account, and that can pay for current account deficits so that they can afford all their imports, these developing countries. Ideally, provides a lot of jobs and growth. Ideally also there's a lot of what we call technology transfer and knowledge transfer. So the multinationals will bring more advanced technology, and the understanding of that can filter through to the rest of the economy. The knowledge, the business practices can filter through to the rest of the economy over time. And the tax revenues, more people in jobs, more income tax, more profits, more corporate tax, more indirect taxes as well. Why might these benefits not arise? Negotiate favorable tax treatment, pay lower taxes as a reward for bringing their huge operation to the country. They might hide their profits in lower taxing countries. I've spoken about that in class, how they do that. They pay a lot of profits back to their home countries, which limits the benefits of the foreign exchange. The competition can force out local firms who can't compete, and they might do capital intensive rather than labor intensive technologies, which don't provide the job. There's also the idea that poorer countries will race to the bottom to attract FDI, keeping